All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Parley, Real People, Real Talk. Eric, thanks for joining me tonight, man. So I recently just learned something about you, and this is kind of what prompted me to want to have you speak here tonight. With your history in, well, who better to explain than yourself? Give everybody kind of like an idea of what you do, what your history is.
Yeah, so in terms of the martial arts history, I studied that when I was in high school, so early or late 1990s. It was in Juko Ryu Jiu-Jitsu, so similar to what I do right now at Greater Durham. And then I got back into it years later. And then now I'm more serious to it. I started doing some Juko Ryu, but then I wanted some extra stuff. I wanted to do some extra training, so I came over to you guys with at Taylor. But and that's how we met. But
Yeah.
along the path in between, I was in the, I did a couple of years of search and rescue, volunteer search and rescue here in Ontario. And then I went into the military. It was a very brief stint, nothing really to write home about. There's other people that have better experience than I do, or more experience than I do, I shouldn't say better, but that have experienced much more than I have. When I was done with that, I got into the railroad. And this is where a lot of the experiences that I've had sort of played a role in where I am now. So in terms of my railroad experience, that's where we started getting into traveling a lot. You experience and learn about a lot of injuries and unfortunately a lot of fatalities in terms of rail incidents. So in terms of that in my career there, responding to incidents, going to derailments, that sort of stuff, doing investigations, moving away from the railroad for a little bit and getting into civil investigations and construction stuff, and still dealing with, pretty critical injury, or some critical injuries, some pretty hard hitting ones, things that affect families, doing investigations with respect to other fatalities like motor vehicle collisions, on the civil side, of course. And then also doing investigations and looking into finding witnesses that had witnessed an extremely violent situation, or that have witnessed a fatality or have been part of that fatal crash. In doing all of this and then starting to interview people that were witnessing this stuff, I'm creating I'm creating my own picture. And I didn't experience it like they did. But what was happening, and I didn't know this until I started doing my trauma training, what was happening to me is that I was recreating it, writing the story in an executive summary for people that I was working for, and basically replaying that in my brain. I was never part of it, but it was something that I was intimately aware of. And fast forward to just before COVID, actually just as COVID had hit us, there was a very near fatal incident just outside of one of our busy corridors here in Ontario. And during that investigation, it was pretty heavy, it was pretty intense. And I had interviewed quite a few people within a very short time frame.
What was the case like? What was the extent of it? Can you give me an idea of what you were having to investigate?
Yeah, I can. I don't want to give up too much detail because there's some privacy stuff in there. But in terms of the event, a worker outside of one of our so everybody knows Ontario, and GO was the busiest, is one of the largest and the busiest rail commuter corridor out here. Late in the evening, a worker wasn't paying attention and was distracted while he was at work. Of course, again, COVID hit, so there's a lot of things going on, right? And he was millimeters away from being struck by a train traveling at 60 miles an hour. No, so I say 60 miles an hour because the railroad still uses that measurement system in the miles. So you can imagine that. So you're going out about 110 kilometers an hour.
Wow.
So close that the train had gone into emergency, for those that are listening that have real experience, because they had thought that they had struck the individual. Because there were many people working around this person, they were taken in, the ones that we could talk to anyways, taken in for witness statements. And so I was the lead investigator in that case, and I was interviewing those individuals. After that was completed, it took about a week and a half for it to be done. I was told to take some time off. I was forced to take it off. But during that time, things at the house were going a little messed up, and I wasn't really understanding what was going on. But it was my wife. And yeah, anyways, something, things got a little hairy around here, and I decided that I needed to do something about it. So I got training. I started looking into it. I got help. And I found out that during my trauma courses, I was experiencing what was called vicarious trauma, or otherwise known as secondary trauma. So it's taking in all of these experiences from the people that I was talking to, and it was essentially being played out in my mind as if I was the one, sort of, right? So it's like it's difficult to explain. But just imagine you seeing something extremely traumatic and then that situation playing over and over in your brain. But you are not the one who experienced it. You just witnessed it. But it becomes so close to you that eventually they don't know where to draw. Sometimes, depending on the severity of it, your brain doesn't know how to draw the line and where to draw the line. So it doesn't tell you the difference. So I was getting triggered by little things, like little tiny things were just setting me off. So fast forward to where I am now, what I want to try and do. So after doing the training, taking the courses, I submitted my papers to the Traumatology Institute, and I was approved, and I was awarded the designation as a community and workplace traumatologist. Now, in that training, it gives me the training and the ability to do early intervention. It gives me the ability and training and qualifications and credibility to be able to do compassion, fatigue, and resiliency education with people, do school crisis response, and be able to do group sessions with people. So I can do an evaluation. I can assist when people are experiencing this. I could do motivational interviewing with individuals. And then, provided their permission is given before all of this happens, I can also do a referral. So I can take it a step up and do the clinical. I can't do the clinical, but I could refer them to an actual clinical traumatologist or a doctor or somebody who's able to do one-on-one with those individuals. So, sorry, go ahead.
What was the reason behind you wanting to get into this? Because this is something that's quite, it's pretty heavy. You're dealing with a lot of people's trauma, like you said. It will affect you. What was the thing that sparked your interest in wanting to do this in the first place?
It was that moment, that very moment at home. It was basically, I was forced to take that time off after that incident had occurred, and there was, it was conversations with my wife, and it was basically like, look, no, something's not right. So, we got to look into it. So when I started looking into resources, so of course our work had the resources, so I spoke with them. But then I started doing more research into like training. How can I train myself into understanding this a little bit more? Because of course there's resources there. But anybody who's familiar with some of those workplace resources, there's a time frame and there's amount of times that you can actually go, and they're very great and they're amazing, but there's a whole process to it. But I was thirsty for more information, not just the fact I felt at the time I didn't want just the Band-Aid. I wanted to know more about how can I recognize this within myself. So that's what prompted me to look into the training a little bit more.
And how eye-opening was it when you started to look and dive into this and start to get educated upon it? What did you find were the most key important things to notice about somebody who's suffering from this?
So the most eye-opening thing, so I'll answer that part of the question first. The most eye-opening part was when I started to go through my what's called the epigenetics. So it's sort of like when we hear about generational trauma, if everybody's heard about that with, we heard about those, the unfortunate incidents with the residential schools. And they're talking about the generational trauma in, let's say, for example, in the indigenous peoples, right? That's essentially what's called epigenetics. So when I started doing what's called a traumagram, I started to look into how deep this can actually go. So somebody, for example, who maybe has experienced extreme violence when they're a child, and let's say, for example, they have that abuse at home, that could, if you're not self-aware of that, that can transfer from generation to generation because that
How
behavior.
so? How so?
So let's say, for example, there's a child, and I'm going to paraphrase like crazy and oversimplify everything. Let's say, for example, there's a household with children that are experiencing extreme violence and abuse from the parents or one parent. Now they grow up knowing that and understanding and learning this. This becomes that behavior that they know of. And some may grow up saying, I'm never going to do that to my kids. And some may say that, but then end up actually doing that to their kids. Maybe not to the extreme severity that they experienced,
Right.
but it starts to channel down, right? And it carries on. As generations grow, if they recognize this stuff, they may not make it as severe and it might lose its severity over time, but it's still there. Somebody who's self-aware might cut it off right away because they understand what triggers them and pushes them to that limit, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
and that's where I kind of want to get into. And so the next part of the question was when I started doing the traumagram myself, thinking about, when you lose a family member, when you lose a job, you're experiencing a lot of stress, for example, with work, all this other stuff, it builds up that stress and that tension inside you because you're trying to deal with this. And then all of a sudden you get that moment where somebody or something happens to you and you just snap, right? That's potential energy that's built up inside us. Now that's just the regular stuff that we deal with during the day, but take somebody who's dealing with extreme violence all the time, police officers, for example, there's a lot of potential energy that they build up over time, right? And there's triggers that happen, and then or they can happen if that person or the people are not as self-aware about that stress that they're feeling, right? And then it's got to come out somewhere. There's a really good book from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And every time we experience or even see or hear something traumatic, we can't walk away not being affected by it. We carry that with us.
Yeah.
And the more emotional, the more extreme it is, the more we carry with us mentally, it starts to manifest itself biopsychosocially and physically within us. We get chronic pain, we get anxiety, we get lose sleep at night, and we don't know why it's happening, right? It's just there's potential energy that's built up inside us that needs that release. So the biggest reason why I want to continue on with this is I've created a 90-minute seminar that I've delivered to law enforcement, retired and current serving law enforcement, military, and I would say hundreds. I wouldn't say thousands, but hundreds of insurance agents that deal with claims, especially like mass casual or huge incident claims, like the fires and stuff like that. So they go through and they're interviewing subjects and people that are trying to make claims and they're at their worst, right? And they're taking all this stuff in. So the seminar that I created is to recognize the stages of response and how we actually take in the information. So smell, sight, hearing it, possibly even tasting some of the stuff up in the air, touching things, right? So we experience that situation through there, and then I go into the victim types and the stages of response there. So talking about, the initial response, looking at fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. One of the other ones that's not really mentioned as much, but the fawning experience is experienced more so when there's something that's so relentless, it doesn't want to give up on kind of like continuing to hit you, that you just become you become so you just do what they want so that it stops, essentially.
Yeah.
Right. So you become their servant, I guess, so to speak, for lack of a better term. But that's the fawning stage. So you go through those stages of response, and then going through the letdown phase. So when we go through the alarm phase and we go through the stages of response, we decide what we want to do. Let's say we want to take action. We go through the action phase and we're super alert. We do our thing. We deal with the situation. Now, if we're constantly dealing with stuff and we never get a chance to go down to stage 4 where it's a letdown and we're processing this and understanding really what had occurred, how it's affecting us, what we saw, what we did, and we're writing this down, basically like a debrief. If we don't get to do that, then whatever's left unchecked just stays stored in our system as potential energy. So I talk to people about that too. Like, it's critical that we do a debrief after an intense situation, right? And if we can't, we have to make time for it at some point. Otherwise, like Bessel van der Kolk says, the body's going to keep the score and we're going to end up paying for it later. And then, so what I also do is help people recognize that this is what happens. So that, let's say, for example, in the world, when we're training and stuff, or you get a client who's coming to you, and eventually I want to get my black belt, I want to become, to the level where I'm trained as well. But this is what I want to help out with, is that somebody comes to you because they're in a household where they want to stop abuse, or they're getting bullied. Now, first of all, we want to teach people not to get into the fight. We want to teach them to de-escalate the situation as much as possible, but sometimes you can't always do that. But then you get that person who's, at the studio or at the dojo, or at the school, and they're learning, and then all of a sudden there's a trigger response during one of the training sessions. What I would like to do is help instructors understand how can we navigate that landscape after that trigger response has occurred, right? Recognizing the stages of response, recognizing that, what I just did helped them, like, triggered them. Maybe we're going to let back, or is it something that's not as severe, maybe benign, that we can help them breathe through and regulate it and release that potential energy that trigger actually caused, or that trigger is there for. So that potential energy is there, wants to come out. We've triggered, or there's a trigger. If it's nothing too severe and we're aware, trauma informed, we can help that person regulate their breathing, get through it. And then while they're doing that, let's say, for example, we're doing counter maneuvers to a submission, right? We got to really think and breathe through everything. And, you and I would, you've caught me so many times, you as my trainer, I do stupid things and I get caught in it. But the important thing is I'm trying to breathe through it, but it's still exhausting. If I go through that scenario with you and something triggers me, I could say, hey, there's something that's going on, but I want to work through this. Or you can say, hey, is there something happening? Do you want to stop, or do you want to go through this?
Yeah, that's my question. Is because, on one-on-one, I think that would be something that's a little bit more simpler to tackle. But, like, for example, if you're teaching a large group of people, and somebody has a trigger, like I've had that before. I was teaching some women's self-defense at a women's shelter, and one of the ladies, like, you can tell she was traumatized, and we were doing a certain exercise and she broke. She broke, and we had to. So for people who are maybe don't have the experience with it, like, what advice would you give to somebody who's conducting a class or a presentation or something, whatever it is, and somebody has that breakdown? Is it better to address it and kind of make them feel like now they're the focus of the room, or is it something that you kind of ignore and approach later? Like, what would be your approach to something like that?
Okay, so my immediate answer to that question would be, first, that depends. The second one is the feed off of that is that depends on the scenario, like how tightly knit. Let's say, for example, that's that group that you were looking at or that you were teaching, and that's where it happened. How close knit are these individuals together outside of the group that you're teaching? If they're close enough and it's a group that you're comfortable with and they're comfortable with you, but this was a triggered event and everyone recognize it, normalize it, because it's a normal reaction to a combination and an accumulation of abnormal situations that person experienced. But what they're experiencing, that trigger, is a completely normal response. It's going to happen. It just, that happened to be the point that brought them over, right? You happen to be in that spot. So, but if it's so bad and so severe, maybe you could, say, hey guys or ladies or everyone, I'm just going to stop for 1 second. right? If you're not comfortable or she's not comfortable with you approaching her, hey, if somebody is, hey, can you go talk to her? Just let her know. I would love to chat with her afterwards, right? But of course, we have to understand the situation, right? So they got to be comfortable. They got to have that. We got to build that trust together. So that has to be there too. So it just, one of the things, if I can say it, and many in the industry or in the field of psychology and people that deal with suicide prevention and training, is that normalize the response. It's not something that should be shunned upon, right? It's not like, oh, I've heard some really bad things in my career too. Talking outside of after an investigation, or chatting about something in the past, and somebody's, they have these off-color comments about that person and their behavior, right? And to me, like, I walk away from it, or I just say it right away. I say, look, that's a normal response to what they just experienced. You can't expect anything, right? Because put ourselves in that situation too. Maybe we wouldn't have done what they did, but over time we will. Something's going to happen. So
like you're saying before, most people are suffering from traumas they're not even aware of,
No.
And
one of the books that I read, I can't remember if it was from Peter Devine or Paul Conti, and this was all during my studies. They're both psychotherapists, and they specialize in trauma, and not, there's more and more that are going into the trauma field in the field of psychology now, but there wasn't as many back then. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk was one of the guys that he started back in the 70s when he was doing residency and stuff like that. Anyways, one of the books by either Paul Conti or Peter Devine, they were talking about, they had a patient actually who, I don't know if you remember the big accident outside of London with all the fog years ago, with like a 200 car pileup. I don't know if you remember hearing about that.
Yeah, vaguely.
So one of his patients happened to be part of that crash. They were fine. They didn't experience any physical harm. They just were in the crash. They had to have the car written off. However, during a bunch of their sessions, after about a year, what he had described was that person had seen and heard stuff during that event. And in the book, they describe what he describes that person describing to him was what the moment that traumatized that individual was seeing the face of the person on the sunroof of the car and hearing them moan and scream until they had unfortunately passed. So they were seated inside looking at this, and that's what they experienced, and that's what traumatized them. So, but they didn't find this out until 15 to 18 years later. I didn't know what was going on. And it was like 5 years after the motor vehicle crash outside of London that the person started experiencing sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, chronic pain in the back, all that other stuff. And after they had started talking to him and getting the proper trauma treatment, that stuff started to slowly go away. And this is years after the fact.
That's crazy.
It is.
I wonder how many people, like I myself, I know two close friends of mine who passed away during COVID. And I really believe that, like, I'm still suffering from effects of that whole thing. Cause I know it's affected me, and it'll affect a lot of people. And I'm just wondering, like, really, how many people have been affected from that and are still not realizing what the impact has been on themselves.
So it's a weird thing to think about. It really is. And I ask myself this too. So there's three types of trauma. So, and and again, I'm oversimplifying this. So there's individual trauma. And then there's collective trauma. So individual trauma is self-explanatory. It's what you or I would experience. Collective trauma would be, a community, what they would experience, like an event. So for example, there's, a tornado that comes through our community and rips things apart, rips roofs off the houses. Our community experiences this as collective trauma, right? Or there's a death in the community. It's somebody that's really close to us. That person knows 100 people, and all those 100 people are affected by that person's death. They're mourning, they're grieving, and all that stuff. So that gives you a little bit of example with the collective traumas. Then there's what's called learned helplessness. And this kind of goes into what may cause what I explained before, the fawning part of the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So during COVID, I don't know if you remember, it wasn't just COVID we were dealing with, right? In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need the sense of social belonging and security, right? Those are the two bottom parts of that pyramid. They're not mutually exclusive. We can't have one without the other. We need the police services. We need our defense forces. We also need the social belonging, right? Those are things that we need. We can't go without them. It's just the way we live. That's the psychological needs that we need. So we're dealing with the COVID side of things. We're in lockdown. We can't see people. So we've lost the social aspect that we need in terms of us as human beings. Those that sought spiritual reflection and the community side of things in churches, mosques, synagogues, any sort of place that they can go where their community gets together and then they pray and then they socialize, all that stuff. We couldn't do that.
Yeah.
There was no ability for group sessions, let's say, for example, for trauma, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, anybody that did anything in a group that helped them cope and get through, that was a positive mechanism, they lost that too. And then while that's happening, there's also this massive, like, huge polarization with the police services, right? That's when things started to really change. And some people were saying defund the police. Some people are saying, no, we need the police. Yes, we do need the police. That's just the way that things are. We need them. But now we're also dealing and hearing about, you had the forest fires, the massive forest fires that were relentless out in BC. You have the earthquakes, you have the floods. We had the country burning basically from both ends, at the east and the west. And then we also had people that were living here, coming here as refugees, running from atrocities and war crimes and stuff like that happening in their countries. So when you are dealing with something like COVID, where everything's shut down and we as people need to depend on others in the social aspect, but we can't see them, and then we're constantly experiencing the collective and the individual trauma on the side, it's like every time we get up, we're being beaten to our knees again.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the learned helplessness side of things. How many people were affected by that? Millions. Right. And it was like, you turn around 3 months later, you're allowed to do something. And then maybe a month after that, no, we got to go back. So we get a little bit of give, we can do stuff and everything. There's some sense of normalcy, and it's just ripped away again. So this just constantly we're experiencing all three types of trauma continuously for 2.5 years. And we don't even know it. So yeah, there's going to be people we're all going to be affected by that. And there's those people that, unfortunately, there were sectors that were allowed to work. Thankfully, I didn't lose my job.
Yeah,
but
me too.
I was doing consulting and safety consulting and risk management for construction firms, and they were still building houses. One of the things that really caught some of our guys was, we're building houses inside of some of the communities that are already built. And there's right beside the one that they're working in, there's somebody that had bought that house just before COVID, who is now living in it. The price of the house is doubled, so it's $1 million plus. But the person who bought that house no longer has a job. So while we're able to go in and work, they're watching us walk into a house, do our thing, but they can't even step foot outside. Right? So yeah, they're going to be a little bit traumatized too, and it's going to bug them. That stress is going to build up. So COVID, yeah, it certainly did a number on people for sure.
And do you think, in your personal opinion, because of all this happening and so many people have been traumatized, and not a lot of people are actually maybe identifying or understanding the effects that's having, that's then translating over to their work life, intimate life, and not a lot of people are going to be looking to have somebody to kind of walk through that with them. Where do you see the trajectory in our society going with regards to mental illness?
Short of actually giving, so I want to say I'm not a clinical traumatologist. So in terms of my opinion, it's probably not going to have a lot of weight from that side of things. But from my training, where I see things and what I can say, is that if I don't want to be the prophet of doom, we don't have to be, right? So if we can normalize the fact that these are not like what we're experiencing is normal and natural responses to the really crappy hand we were dealt with, then that's the first step. Because once we accept that it's normal and we can cope with that, then we can walk through the rest of the crap together, or the rest of the rest of whatever they're dealing with together, if they're willing, right? But at the end of the day, we can't force anybody to do anything. It's just recognizing first us being self-aware, but them helping them sort of explore that awareness too, if that makes sense. But the biggest step is understanding that it's normal. It's not like, back in the day when, if we were feeling down, we, suck it up, suck that upper lip up or whatever, and just carry on, be a man, right? We can do that for so long before it starts to.
That's a bit difficult though, because to say it's normal, like, okay, maybe the response we're having, that in itself is normal for us to react a certain way. But what we're actually going through and living through, I don't believe it's normal, man. Like, there's some really, if you just look at certain aspects of society, it's like I look at, I'm like, this doesn't feel normal. This feels, it feels like everything but, and it's and then I think that's what kind of, I've heard many people that I talk to just like they feel like they're living in the twilight zone. They don't even know how to react and speak to people in public because the mindset is totally off. The moral compass is totally off. There's no common reference point in which people can start to engage. If we both agree that it's not raining outside, if we, no, it is raining. No, it's not. It's dry. Like, we don't even have that same kind of like even playing field where we can start from a reference point. And I think that gap is getting wider and wider. And some people are like, I know a lot of people are just reverting into just shutting down and just closing the door and staying home because they just don't get it outside, And
So,
do you think that's a good thing, or that the total shut off, or the segregation? Is that a normal response?
well, I think there's a stem. I think there's a root that stems from a normal response. I just think but I'm gonna go back a little. Some of this started to happen a little bit before COVID too.
Yeah.
But I think what COVID and the response to COVID and what we all experience, and again, it's extremely unfortunate, right? And I think that basically that served as a force multiplier, and whatever was occurring prior to that. This is just a perspective. It's not really. I'm not going to put my opinion out there, but from my viewpoint, whatever was occurring, COVID didn't help and served as a force multiplier and just increased the speed at which it was as which it started to happen. So we take, let's say, for example, and I'm not putting anybody out there, but there was a lot of information shared online, and it still is, but there's a lot of information shared in terms of news articles, and there's people reading news articles, for example, or just reading the headlines, maybe the first couple of paragraphs, not reading the whole thing, reposting that article with their own opinion, but it wasn't connected to the article in any way, really, right? So, and that's just an example. So there'd be an opinion attached to that article based on what they read briefly, but they didn't complete it. So there was no critical analysis to it, no reasoning, no logic to it. And then that sort of gets reshared and reshared and reshared the same way. And eventually everything loses its meaning, but you just see this headline that is completely misleading from what the actual article is saying. So there's those types of things that happen. And then there's other people too that just, they some, I guess this, they don't have, they're experiencing that trauma, and they're going the only way they know how to go about it because there's no support, right?
In your studying this, is there different or main key responses or coping mechanisms that a child has coping with trauma versus an adult coping with trauma, or are they relatively the same?
Coping mechanisms. So some of there's natural ones. There's and again, not my opinion, just stuff from the studied from. when I was doing one of the courses and doing some research in one of them, and it was talking about interviewing after trauma. Um, and they had taken a study from a bunch of children who, so they were children at the time of the experience, but they were around in Japan when the atomic bomb was dropped. And those that survived, they grew up 20 years later. They had taken information from those people that were monitored post World War II for that time frame. And so they looked at all of their drawings, like when they were in school, essays, things that they wrote, how they expressed themselves. They monitored them and documented everything. And what they noticed is that through artistic expression, and this is just one key component for children, for example, artistic expression was, in a way, drawing sort of what they were feeling. So, for example, one child, and I'm trying to recall this one here. So one child had drawn this massive black mountain with an orange sky, and then just red speckles across the end of the black mountain, and then some red, and then like a river at the bottom. And then when that child was interviewed by a psychotherapist, they asked him, what were you thinking? Can you explain to me what this makes you feel like, and what you think of when you see this? And basically, to that child was, when they were sitting, they were still far away, but they got to see it. They were far away, and they saw the explosion. Right?
Wow.
That's all they saw. But when they were told what happened, that's how they kind of brought it all. So they were told, people were killed, people died, and there's a lot of people. So that mountain represented to him, in his mind, the amount of people that were taken, what had occurred, and the speckles of the red and the river of blood at the bottom. So with children, from the stuff that I've read, a lot of this stuff can be heavily expressed through art. So like and there's a lot of teachers that actually trained to look to see this when they're at school too, right? Based on what they're drawing during classes. And through music, there's children that, get rid of that potential energy through activity. So, and again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a person that's going to put my opinion on it, but some of the research has indicated and revealed that there's certain children that have been, let's say, for example, 2 years before, been diagnosed with hyperactivity, like an ADHD of some kind. But later on found out that was as a result of, some potential energy stored in that person. And they were super hyperactive.
Yeah.
Right. Can it be dealt with and navigated? Sure. Right. And if done, like, that's not something I'm trained to deal with, but recognizing that could be something that happens or has happened is something that I can see. And, sort of like, I can, what do you call it? I could look at it, I can assess, and then maybe refer, but I can't do the children stuff, right? It's stuff that's there in my studies that is part of it. So me and you, I can talk about that. I can recognize what's going on with the children, but I can't do any referrals. I can't do group sessions with them. I'm not licensed to do that. That's not part of my training. But those are the three key things that I would say that we could learn a lot from. Right?
Yeah.
We could benefit from really paying attention to it in children right now. Is looking at
I find with my daughter, when she was going through COVID, like I was paying attention to her drawings, and one of the things I noticed is she showed me this picture. It was a mermaid swimming in the water, but the mermaid was crying, and it had a mask on its face. And it was shocking to me, because it's like, that was, I talked to my kids about it. I spoke, make sure that they were okay. I made sure that I spent time with them, and I took, you say, normalized things, but it was the first time where the impact, it was a subtle hint of, what they were feeling. And it was a shock, right? But I just find it really amazing how kids deal with trauma, and the way they deal with it is really through their expression of art, or just like lashing out. But art is definitely a big one. Do you
Art,
do
yeah,
you think it's the same with adults, or do adults kind of tend to do
of course.
something
Yeah.
different?
Yeah, and again, same with adults, right? Like a lot of us, there's people that take up music, try to learn music by themselves, play guitar, right? Anything where we're trying to, where we find we have to really focus on our fine motor skills, and get that coordination going. Yeah, for sure. Is that now again? It could be, it could be a natural resilience response, right? Is it a good therapeutic response? 100%. Right. So if we know that that's what makes us feel good, that's our self-care. Sure. So if painting, if playing guitar, playing piano, whatever it is that we find is our vice, like for me right now, training in martial arts is something I love, right? Because I have to focus, right? And if I don't, I feel I get an instant response if I'm not doing the right thing. For example, when you end up getting a gut shot on me, or you get me in the side of the head, right? I'm not doing something right. There's an instant response for me that I got to focus and regroup, right? Mentally. So for me, that's what it is. For others, could it be playing guitar, learning a new song? Sure. Um, some people, driving is good. They just love the fact that they could drive, listen to music, and just be alone. People be on a motorcycle. There's tons of things that we find that are self-care for us. We have our own thing. Um, Planting, like people that have their own home gardens, they love doing that too in the winter or in the summer. Um,
So essentially, it's looking for a positive way to escape whatever the trauma or impact it's had on you. It's kind of like you
yeah,
say, the key word that I'm hearing here tonight is energy. We're storing that energy from whether it was a something seemed like a car accident, a work accident, or something. Is that energy that's involved with that impact? And if we don't find a resolution for that, it's just going to build, and that's like you say, it's going to pass down generational, or it's going to come out in other things. What is it you think like? Some people are lucky; they have an avenue where they can go and like you say, play guitar or stuff like that. Is it the people who don't have any hobbies or interests that kind of fall into the drugs, into the alcohol when they're dealing with trauma, that then starts to be a numbing agent for them to escape that way? Except it's like a negative path, I guess.
yeah. So there's a few parts to that. So to answer the first part of the question, yes, it could be that from so I also studied global and domestic terrorism at Dalhousie University, actually just before I did my trauma stuff. So we deal with like the sociology and stuff like that leading up to it. The meat and potatoes of the terrorism side of things, right? So the sociological aspect of it. So to give you an example, and I think I can't remember if you and I have talked about this before, but to answer that part of the question, is it people that don't have those resources that might revert to those negative coping mechanisms? Unfortunately, if you look at the statistics according to the studies, it would suggest yes, more so, right? So if I can give one example, let's say, for example, in a less fortunate or a less secure neighborhood, for example, and you have, or even just online, let's say, for example, you have a kid that's experiencing learned helplessness, like they're constantly dealing with negative stuff and they don't know what to do. They just need a way out. All of a sudden, they log in online, they go onto Facebook, and they start messaging people, or they go into a forum where they post something. Hey, I'm having a bad day. If you take a person, let's say, and I studied human trafficking too in that side of things when I was doing everything. But if you take somebody who had malicious intent and saw and was friends, or by proxy, saw the post because they were friends of a friend online, and then say, hey, I'm having a bad day, and they see the picture, I'm like, oh, this is perfect. I'm going to message that person, right? And say, hey, I can help you out. I'd like to chat with you. I'm here to talk. They build a friendship, and they start to see that they've got something to go to with that person, something positive that starts to put a little spring back in their step. They're looking forward to that. That person's intent is wrong. Hey, I can help you out. You don't need to go back to school anymore. I can help you get a job. Just here's what you need to do. Whether it's they get into trafficking, human trafficking side of things, sex trafficking, or drugs. Or it's just, hey, I'm going to help you out. I'm going to sell you a couple of grams of whatever it is, and it's going to help you out. Or, hey, come hang with us on Friday. We're going to go for a drink. they start to feel that sense of camaraderie and that sense of being, and that becomes a negative coping mechanism, if that makes sense. So there's one part of it. But then there's the other part too. Let's say, for example, in a country where there's people growing up and all they know is negativity, right? That's their norm. And the only positive side of things, other than going to school for them, and some of them that's a privilege and they can't get that, is to be part of that gang, right? And that's where they feel like a sense of belonging. That's where they have that sense of belonging. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
So if could that be one of the causes? It can be. It very much can be. And do they have the resources? Unfortunately, some of them don't. And that's where those negative coping mechanisms come in. Now, that's from a societal perspective. There are professionals, again, that deal with this stuff too, right? There's people who, again, don't feel like it's normal that this is a good response. So what happens? They end up getting into, some people get into negative coping mechs like alcohol and drugs. Even as a professional, lawyers, dentists, doctors, anybody can fall into or get trapped in that. If whatever coping mechanism that they decide to do, whether it's negative or positive one, if it makes them feel good, then that I guess that what do you call it? That addictive brain starts to kick in, right? That dopamine level gets increased for a little bit, where this makes me feel great. I feel happy. I feel warm. This is it. This is, or it takes the edge off, for example. So this is what they use to cope, but eventually it becomes such a dependency that it negatively impacts the life.
Yeah, and it's now compounded. Now they're creating more trauma upon themselves based off of root trauma.
Exactly, exactly. And then the other thing too is that alcohol, yeah, it takes the edge off. It makes it lowers our inhibitions, and I'm just using that as an example. But in effect, alcohol is actually a depressant, right? When that sugar wears off, when your body's digested everything and metabolized that long after it's been through the system, you know, the what's that term, hair of the dog, people say, you feel a little bit better when you have the next drink because you feel so crappy after the night you had before because of the hangover, right? So it becomes a cycle that we fall back into.
When you have people who have, so I don't know. This is why I ask you, and I'm not sure if this is even a stupid question or what, but people who are suffer trauma, like you say, on the rails, people witness an accident, something like of that nature, or something by sexual nature, or something through verbal abuse in the home. These
Yeah.
are all different types of traumas, and they'll fit into different types of categories. Within these different types of traumas, do you kind of see a common response to a particular type, or is the response to trauma kind of like general across the board, no matter what type of trauma?
So our physiological responses are going to be the same, because that's the way our brains are wired. Now, if let's say, for example, and my hat goes off to them, but let's say, for example, first responders, police officers,
Yeah, they see a lot.
and they go from call to call to call, right? And like I said, sometimes from call to call to call, there's those four phases of response, right? You're seeing what's happening, your brain's deciding what's going to happen, you take action, and then you should have a letdown phase. That letdown phase doesn't happen all of the time. They go through, even in the military and in certain support units, search and rescue and stuff like that, you go through what can be categorized as stress inoculation training, similar to what we do in drills and martial arts, right? You you continue the drill over and over and over again, until it becomes second nature. When you do certain response type drills and training, it becomes second nature when you show up. Now, because you're just reacting to it as a secondary, basically as your first response is to show up, your secondary response is to do what you're trained to do. Because you're doing that and it becomes instinctive and intuition, you don't end up completely seeing everything around you. So you develop a sort of a myopic view and you don't see the peripheral. So but your body your brain still records all of that. So let's say, for example, you can see everything that's here, but I can't see everything that's here when I'm responding to an incident. Or for example, when you and I are sparring, where I'm paying attention is your body, your shoulders, your hands. I want to see your movement. I'm still taking in my brain is still taking in all the information around us, but the person I'm solely focused on is you. Now, with around everything that, let's say, for example, you and I are in actual real fight. And inside that, and I'm just using this for exemplary purposes, but inside that house that you and I are fighting in, there's a ton of other really crappy things happening. But we're not taking that in right away. We're focusing on me and you. That happens. By the time I'm done or you're done with me, the dust is sort of settled too around us. Okay, great. We deal with the situation. We walk out. Now we do that. How many times do police officers do that every day?
Yeah.
Right? They could walk into like call after call after call. Their 12-hour shift, there's a lot of stuff that happens. Right? But all that stuff that's out here that they didn't completely focus on is still being recorded in here. The smells, what they hear, the things that they touch, everything they see, to the point where they're here, but also here. That all builds up and it starts to fog the brain up. So our brain starts to, like, we don't recall things like it's stored on a movie screen or in a movie reel where we could just push record, pick the movie out, put it in the playlist, and then record and then play it. We reconstruct images that we see in our brains, and that's how it's stored, and then it's deconstructed when we don't need it anymore, and it's just thrown wherever. So when those bits and pieces from the outside don't make sense because they're all being built into something that, let's say, for example, there's a trigger, all of a sudden, shit, yeah, now I'm remembering that, pardon my language, but I'm remembering that fight that Mark and I had. And holy crap, actually, beside us, there was actually something else happening. And that's what's really bothering me, right? So, if we don't have time to go through those situations, go through the letdown phase, do a debrief with ourselves, really realize what happened in complete, like in its completion or in its entirety, then that could cause that buildup of potential energy and that trauma, that buildup that needs to explode or get out of us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, when you're saying that, I'm thinking a lot of like law enforcement officers who will have a shift where they see stuff like that. And is it practice that they take that time to, have that post-mortem and decompress? Because if they're family men, and they go, or women, and they go home to their family and they're still storing that energy, that's when you say it gets leaked out into the family life, or the interaction with the child, or their home life. Or I also know that they'll go out for drinks with the boys after the thing, and then that, like you said before, that starts to be the common thing that they do now to get that release. But now it can start to cause another problem. What kind of things in your training have you been told or shown or found that leads to good debriefing? Something that you can do for yourself, or process that you can do yourself. Let's say it's the end of the shift, or at the end of that kind of stuff before you go home.
So for me, what I found was writing, because it was right there for me. So I always had a notebook. Actually, the notebook that I have is similar. I don't have it down here. Actually, I have one. So my notepads are very similar to like what a police would have. It's just made for safety, right? So every time I show up somewhere, you fill out the notepad. You do your thing because you want a documentation of everything that has occurred through your shift. But you don't always have time to put a lot of detail in it. Sometimes when you show up, you got to put the date. That you start off the day with the date. You put the time in the margin. You write where you are, the address. I do a quick thing about the weather, why I'm there, all that other stuff, and then very key things that I saw when I was out there, right, and interactions. But not all the detail goes in there. So what I found for me, now again, I can't speak to police practice or what they have. What I found for me right away to understand the entire day for me is to postscript it, put a time down at the end of my day, end of shift, put another time in the margin, postscript, and then I just start writing. I put all details, everything. not how I feel, but details of what things happened. What I do later on when I start to feel, hey, I'm feeling a bit stressed, or there's something that's bugging me about that day, I'll go back on my notebook. I'll open up Word on my computer, and I look at the details. I just start writing my opinions or how I felt. That's for me. It's not because I can't put my opinions or my feelings in this, because if I ever there was ever anything in question, and again, due diligence is huge in the safety side of things. So if I ever had to go to court and defend anything from a due diligence perspective, I can't put my opinion or my feelings in here. So I take the detail that I did put in here, the data dump, and look through it, and then I'll write it down on a Word file. I have so many things, and then I've turned them into blogs. Right.
That's actually pretty smart, and I think it's pretty healthy. And I like the fact that you distinguish the two. Having the facts is important, legally, logistically, but having the ability to then take a time. And you know what's cool too is you're doing it on a different time, so you're not going to feel the same as when you felt it at that moment. You have time to process it. So now when you write down those feelings, they've marinated for a while. Yeah, I do something similar where if I'm going through something, I'll record myself what I'm thinking, how I'm feeling, and then I don't listen to it. And then like a week from now or 2 days from now, when I'm not in that same state, I'll then listen to it.
Yeah.
And it's funny because you sound like a different person, or like
Yeah.
you see what they're feeling, be like, oh wow, that wasn't really what I'm seeing now, or I give myself advice, like if I'm in a mental state and I'm thinking like this, I'm thinking negatively, I'll listen to that. And then when I'm not in that state, I'll record myself giving my that person advice. And then when I'm in my bad state, I'll listen to that sober state. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
but I like how you distinguish writing down facts versus opinion, and having both of those ways to kind of let that out.
Yeah. There's that just happened in terms of what I do for a living, right? And police officers will experience that too. Only facts, only what you see goes in that, based on like it's factual. Your feelings don't go in there. Your opinion doesn't go in the book, because that'll get destroyed in a court setting, right? But it makes me think of just this. And again, if you're religious or not, or there's people that are they're spiritual, but it's like the serenity prayer, right? It's like, God, give me the courage to or give me the what is it? I can't remember the first one, but anyways, the ability to go through something, right? To see it, to deal with it, the courage to walk through it. But then also the biggest part is the wisdom to know the difference between the things that we can control and the things that we can't.
That's huge.
Right. So when I go through this, essentially, that's like what you were saying to me. I'm writing down the facts. That's the part that's being filtered through my brain right away, especially at the end of the day. A couple of days later, when the feelings have simmered and I'm not feeling as hot or hot-headed, I guess, so to speak, for the lack of a better term, and I'm not as, my ire is not up, my emotions aren't involved, I'll go through it, read the facts, and then write the emotional side of things and my personal stuff. That helps me cope with it.
Do you find that's a practice that's given a lot to people who have undergone severe trauma, is to have a documentation of it?
So again, in terms of the trauma, I'm not at the clinical side of things, but we hear about like some of them go through like revisiting the situation in terms of the psychological side. And there's some that are told, write it down. There's some that are, that will go into, let's say, for example, dance or art, like acting, like not in, like stage acting, like doing plays. Again, it's a form of artistic expression. Some of that stuff, there's people that get into that, or they'll go into playwriting. One of the books that I was reading, I think actually was, again, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's, the book, The Body Keeps the Score. He was actually talking about some of his patients that he started noticing that when he was asking the patients what they were doing in their personal time, some of them were getting into acting, like doing stage plays, just with some social groups, and that's how they were coping. That's what helped them express themselves. And they got so far into it, they were writing the stories based on their experiences. So they would write a stage play based on what they had experienced, and then the actors would act it out.
That's interesting. It's almost like too maybe they get into acting so they can be somebody else, so they don't have to be who themselves and reliving that. I've heard that before too. Some actors do that. They just, it's a way of release. They get to act like somebody else, somebody they want to be, somebody they haven't been.
Yeah,
It's funny
there's
how
that.
we all go for certain things, eh?
Beg your pardon, sorry.
I said it's funny how anybody who's traumatized, they're always gonna look. They're always gonna find an avenue to release it, but sometimes it's not. It's very subtle. Sometimes it's very apparent. Sometimes it's positive. Sometimes it's negative. I also think that maybe your environment around you is what gives you that chance to deal with your trauma. If you have a good environment around you,
Yes.
it's going to be much easier. And that's just like a self check thing too. Like I ask myself too sometimes, like, with what I'm going through, other people have it worse. I have to be lucky, and I have to take inventory of what I have in my life, what I'm lucky for. Even though what I'm going through is what I'm going through, and I will deal with it. And sometimes you're down, but you have to look around and be like, I am lucky though. I am blessed. These are good things happening to me. Bad shit happens to everybody, but I need to kind of check that, because if we don't check that and we always get stuck in that, like, oh, why is this happening? Why is this happening? You will create that negative energy and you will feed that trauma.
100%. And there's that saying, they say misery loves company, right? And sometimes that there's that self-talk that we go through. And then, like you said, it turns into some pretty negative stuff, and we can go into some pretty dark places. But there's also that in a group setting, right? So being emotionally available to first having our self-awareness in check, but also being humble enough and a good enough friend to recognize that somebody in our group may or may not be going down that path. But then, let's say, for example, is sort of trying to, that begins to feed into or bleed into others. So the misery loves company thing starts to go into them, and they start to try and it starts to bring others down, right? So if we're good enough friends, we're not going to let that bug us. We're going to be, if we're self-aware and we're aware of that, we can turn around to that person and say, hey man, I think there's something up. Let's chat, right? I'm here to check in. I'll chat when you're ready. We don't want to say, hey man, you're bringing everybody down. Get out of here. Right. If we're good enough friends with this person, that's, it's the opposite. Hey man, I know there's something, like, I feel like there's something happening.
That goes back to your point of normalizing it, right?
Yeah. Like, hey, let me know when you're ready to talk, but I'm here, man. You don't want to get to the point where you're saying, hey man, you're bringing the whole group down. We don't want to see you again, because then that person's going to be like, oh yeah, you know what? Screw, no more with this. They're going to find somebody that's going to make them feel good for what they're feeling at the time, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because it is pretty hard when we go into a dark spot to climb out of it. Sometimes there's things that we have done and it's our own fault. But again, like, go back to, recognizing, there's things that are our own fault that we did that have gotten us into a situation that we're in. But then there's also things that are beyond our control, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to deal with the stuff that is our fault.
For anybody who out there, like, there's a few people on here, but this will be watched later again. If you have a spouse or a friend or anybody going through trauma, or if they've just been through something at work, or like you say, you notice them going through some stuff, field, when you deal with somebody, how do you approach them, right? Like, how do you approach them? What kind of questions you ask? What kind of things and signs you look for? And then how do you address them? Just to give some idea to people who maybe know somebody at home or a loved one that's going through some trauma, and they want to be there for them, but are not sure how to approach or assess them.
So at home, I mean, there should be most of the time there's a comfort level that we could be pretty direct with stuff, right? Sometimes we can't, depending on the age of the child too, right? Sometimes if we're too direct with our kids, we could put them off, and they're not going to want to talk to us. So we could be pretty indirect with the child and just start playing with them, right? And just start asking them how their day went. How do you feel? What's going on? Right? Yeah. My daughter and I, we wrestle a ton.
Yeah.
So much, right? Like, we love it. I love it. She loves it. I taught her trap and rolls and stuff like that, and she's just over the moon about that stuff, right? And she loves it. But when we get into stuff and I start to hear like that, oh, I can't breathe, or that one hurts or whatever, we go super, super slow. And I start talking, okay, what about that didn't you like? Right? So similar to when I'm noticing, not quite herself. Tell me about your day. What happened? How was your day? If I ask how's your day, she'll be like, good. And then I'll ask the one key question later on at night, and it's just about as we're about to go to bed. I'll be like, so tell me about what happened, after daycare or at daycare. You told me something when we were at dinner. At dinner time, something was off, and you were unhappy. Explain that to me. How does that make you feel a little bit? And then, woof, the floodgates open, right? Yeah, okay, it's time for bed, but do I want to shut her down? No. Right? I want to let that go, right? Because that's her time. That's how she found it. So sometimes, like with kids, like for me, anyways, that's with me. Like it's very indirect when it comes to that. Me and my wife, there's no filter with the two of us. We're pretty direct with each other. So, and that's good if we have that, right? If somebody has that ability to do that, then great. In a work setting, I take the really indirect approach. We just go with small talk. How was your day? How's it going? Good morning. Great. Have small talk. And then if you notice something's different, and it's got to be time appropriate, person appropriate, because unfortunately in work settings there are hierarchies, right? There's management, there's peers, there's all kinds of stuff, right? So there's finding the right moment and the right place and time to the setting, the atmosphere, all of that stuff. So being indirect for me, as I found, is the best approach. And most of the time, I would say 99 or 98% of the time, it's been pretty effective. Whether they speak directly about the situation that's bugging them, or they just I was happy. I happened to be that person that they let that potential energy out with. One example that I can give, and it's pretty, like, this is one of the other ones too that hit hard for me in a good way, but still, man, it's a surreal feeling. In 2013, I responded to, so in 2013, there had been an individual that was struck by a freight train just inside London at one of their road level crossings. And while I was driving my truck, I heard it on the radio go through. So I heard the emergency call go through. I heard the rail traffic control starting to talk to the engineer and the conductor of the train. And they had mentioned that EFAP, like the EAP, and the crisis manager or the crisis responder was on their way, but they were 2 hours out. At the time, I had some training, and so I got on the radio. I spoke to the RTC, talked to the train master and the chief, and I got permission to respond because I didn't want to just show up. So I responded, and when I showed up, it was not like, it turned out that it wasn't just one person that had been struck; it was several. So it was not great. And talk about, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but like for me, when we talk about how we take in trauma, like this, the sight, the smell, the sound, and the taste, that one hit for me. It still does. So, but when I showed up though, like it was like I had that mission objective. So when I showed up, I parked far away. They already had incident command there in terms of the police. CN police had responded. London police were there. The roadmaster and the chief weren't there yet. So when I spoke to the police, I let them know who I was. First, they asked me if I wanted to take a tour and a walk to look at all the debris, and I said no, I'm good. I could see enough of it already. I'm not here for that. I'm here to talk to the train crew. When I showed up and I got into the cab, right away I could feel it. You know something was heavy, right? I just introduced myself. I gave them my phone number. I told them where I worked, what my role was, and why I was there. And I said, look, I'm just going to have a seat here. And I had quit smoking. But I could see the other one was smoking like chain smoker. And so to me, I was like, you know what? Like, I just want to, let's step out of the cab. right? Because the smell of the smoke for me was off. So we stepped out of the cab, went into the truck, and we just sat there. And then we started talking about stuff that wasn't even part of the situation. And it was based on all their, like, it was whatever they wanted to talk about, I just talked about. That incident occurred. I was debriefed. I left. That was it. 5 years, almost like 5 years, like minus or plus a day to that day. I was way up north, up in Nakina, Ontario. So for anybody that doesn't know where that is, think of where Thunder Bay is, and then think of another 4.5 hour northwest.
Wow.
Right. That's another drive up there. So it's up there. There's not much up there, but there's a rail house, there's a rail bunkhouse and camp out there. And I was going up there to do an audit on, do some audits and inspections on some new signals that were being put up out there and track protection. So the guys that I was going out there to see, they were in charge of protecting all the workers out there. So when I first showed up, I was listening to the radio, listening to the procedures. Then I drove up to where he was watching what was happening, engaged in conversation. He's got to go do his job, so we have to high rail. So that's those trucks that get to drive on the track, right? So I was like, I'll stick around. I'm up here anyways. It's not like I can go home. So I'll hop in with them, and we started chatting and talking about our careers. And we got on the topic. It is not uncommon, similar to police or fire and ambulance, anybody who's a first responder in some way. Some talks or conversations get into some pretty dark areas, and and then so he said, yeah, have you ever been to any in your career as an inspector with the railroad, doing engineering inspections and just responding to derailments, have you ever been to a fatality? I said, yeah, a few. And I just happened to say, one that I'll never forget, like really gets to me. Not anymore, but it is definitely one that is the first that comes to mind. I said, is a multiple fatality in London. And he hit the brakes on the truck, and I could feel goosebumps jump up on my hands and my arms, and I just felt a lump in my throat. And he stares at me, and he's like, "That was you?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Wait a minute, hang on. And I looked at him. He got out of the truck. I got out of the truck. I was like, "What the heck's going on?" And he gave me a big bear hug and didn't put me down. And then he told me that had I not shown up that night, he was actually ready to walk out of the cab and go jump off the bridge.
Wow.
So I barely said a word the night of the incident. We talked about everything that wasn't related to the event.
That's what he needed.
And that's all that he needed. Of course, yes, he got EFAP, he got help outside of that. The work, the company paid for everything. So he's very well and is doing very well now. And I talk to him regularly now. But in that moment, if nobody had shown up when him and the engineer both said, like, if somebody does 2 hours, my God, no, that's not cool. So had somebody not shown up, they were gone. So it makes my throat heavy right now. But the day that he told me, like, man, I felt like I was being hugged by a ghost.
That's crazy.
So when I think about, somebody might just need, hey, they just need some cool off time, or they just might need you to be there. That couldn't be more true.
Man, we really don't. Just the smallest word, the kindest, the smile, the wave, that can make all the difference, eh?
It can, yeah.
That's
just
crazy.
knowing. And again, we're not normalizing society. What we're doing is we're trying to normalize. We're trying to help them understand that it's normal, that they're like, it's normal for them to have the responses they're having. It's normal. Like, again, was his response or somebody's response to wanting to go and end it for themselves normal based on what they just experienced? And then their mind being flooded with all kinds of stuff? Yeah, maybe it was a normal response. Right? But that's what we need to tell people. That's what we need to help people out understand. That's normal, man. You just saw, or you just experienced the most difficult thing you could ever experience in your life. That's normal. Let me help you walk through that. And that goes back to people who, let's say, for example, go through the stress inoculation training. We train to respond, or we train to react based on our fundamentals of training, right? So we go in there, we don't rise to the occasion. It's whatever the basics are. Like, I was listening to another podcast, they're talking about UFC fights, and somebody has statistically analyzed the 5 most common moves and submissions that people go into in an actual UFC fight, and the real deal, right? We could be taught hundreds of things throughout our throughout our education in martial arts, but you get into a real situation, you're going to revert back to the same things over and over. What is normal and feels good for you at the time. So you can go through, you and I, let's say, for example, and we'll pick 5 other people. We'll all go through the same training for 3 months at the exact same time, know the same things, and then we could respond to the same scenario, but based on our core values. So everything that we learned and experienced prior to the training that we went, right, is going to basically be the root of how things are going to affect us. So if I lived a life, let's say, for example, in a mansion, I never had anything wrong in my life. Everything, it was amazing. But your life leading up to it, you had to scratch and bite and fight for everything you had. And you experienced personal bullying, aggressiveness towards you, like everything. Right? But we go into this training, we do this stuff for 3 months. We get stress inoculated. We go in, we do our thing. We're both trained to respond the same way. We do. But over time, you're going to have a different stress response than I will based on the core values that we've had prior to that event. Right? So I can go another, let's say, for example, I could go another 20 years and not be affected by trauma. And that, but you, let's say, for example, and just again, for example purposes, and you do this for 18 months and all of a sudden you're like, no, this is not for me. This is too much. The core values that you had prior to, and all the experiences you had prior to, and then plus compounding all of the experiences you're experiencing in your professional life, let's say it is the police side of things, you just set everything up, right? So some people might look and say, well, how come Mark is dealing with that? Well, he's being a wuss, right? We went through the same training. I know what it's like. And then we start to one up each other. Oh, you didn't do this. You didn't do that. You didn't see this. You should have been there for that. This is what I had to deal with today. But it's all of this stuff that led up to it. Everything is built up. It's, again, that potential energy.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. Before we go, what advice do you have for anybody who's, who has dealt with trauma, who's having a hard time dealing with their trauma? What places can they reach out to? What advice would you give them? For anybody out there listening who has trauma or is dealing with trauma or knows somebody dealing with trauma that could use some help.
First one, understand that it's in whatever you're dealing with, and the responses that you're having, the reactions that you're having is a normal response to abnormal stuff that they've experienced. That's the first thing. Understand that that's what's going on. We're not bad people. We're not. It's not bad for us to react this way, right? It's a normal response to it. Second one would be, once we're comfortable understanding that it's normal, we're comfortable understanding that there's things that have occurred that weren't our fault, that are beyond our control. Be in the present. Be right now, right? If we can make peace with understanding that how we're feeling is a normal feeling, understanding that we couldn't control some of this stuff, let's now be now in the present, right? We can't change what happened before. We have to turn the page and write the next chapter. So let's do that. We can do that. And then the other part to that piece would be, I'm there for you, right? So if people could take that away and say that and accept that with each other, be there for that person, right? Be there to listen. We actually don't have to be the person that gives them a piece of advice. There's some people that are saying, well, I'm having a bad time. And you get that person that's part of our group or part of the group that says, here's what you should do, right? There's always something like that. But understand that we don't have to do that. We could just say, you know what? I'm here for you, man. Give me a shout whenever you can. Or I'll give you a shout tomorrow. Let's chat. Right? That might be all they need. So if they're experiencing it, know that they can have somebody. Like, look for that positive person, look for that positive feeling, that positive coping mechanism. Right? Find something to get rid of that potential energy. Find that person to talk to. Find the resources. The other part of that, though, is that if they're so far into it, and they really need the help, there's crisis lines out there. Canada just got a 3-digit crisis line, which I think is amazing. It's 988. Right. So if they're feeling like they're in crisis, give that line a call. If they have social services in their area that helps them out, if they have a friend or a family member that is let's say if they're a sponsor for something, whether it's Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, anything like that, or a friend at work is the person that they deal with, right? Just be there, man. Like, I know it's tough. I get it. It's hard. And find the positive coping mechanisms. I'm not saying I have a drink every once in a while. But for me, I recognized early on that if I was going to have one, I always did a self-check for some reason. I don't know why. It's just, I've always been that way. I've asked myself, what frame of mind am I in before I open this up?
Yeah, that's huge.
Right?
That's huge.
And I have, me personally, and people might laugh, but I have the discipline to say, no, it's not it. Today's not the day for me to have one.
Yeah.
Even if I feel like, I haven't had one, because I don't drink it. I don't have any, I don't have them that often. But sometimes you feel like, I'm going to have one when I get home today. But then between the time that I've decided that I'll have one when I get home and when I do get home, stuff happened. And I was like, no, I said I was going to have a drink tonight. I really need that one. Again, the self-check happens before I even open the fridge or before I open the bottle. I'm like, no, you know what? I'm not going to have it. Right? Because I wasn't quite okay when I got here or just before I got here. And I don't want that to come back out. I'm going to go use a different coping mech. Am I going to do some push-ups, maybe 10 push-ups or whatever it is? Use the pull-up bar, do something, or just be with my kid and family. Sometimes it's all I need.
Most times.
Right? Actually, most times that's what it is. Family. We have 2 dogs, got a daughter, and my wife. Like, sometimes it's just talking, and sometimes if it's something silly that I'm frustrated about, my wife's not afraid to tell me. It's like, no, that's on you, right? So, and just having people around us, man. If they're positive, go into the dojo, right? Go into train, hit the bags, put the gloves on.
Yeah. Well, listen, Eric, I really appreciate what you had said here tonight. A lot of it is food for thought. I know it's going to help people out there, and just understanding the key thing I took away was normalizing what's going on, understanding that this is a normal response to trauma, so that you don't feel alienated or ashamed. I think that's a big one, and the idea of holding on to energy, unresolved energy, can cause that torment or cause the dysfunction, and having a way to release it, I think, is another key thing I took away from this conversation. So I appreciate what you do, man. I appreciate the impact you have on people. It's pretty cool. I deal with a lot of people, and as I get to know them, I know a lot of the people I know are so diverse. But it's very cool to discover what people do for a living sometimes, and the knowledge they have. And even though I might share some stuff with you, I know I can learn from anybody I meet. So I appreciate you taking the time and giving me some education on the topic.
Well, thank you. Actually, it was nice to get the invite, and it was just no, it felt cool when we were training and you said, actually, I want you on the podcast. I'm like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, I started this. This was my coping mechanism, man. When I was going through COVID, when we were in COVID, I've said this before. Like, I don't do this podcast because I'm trying to be a podcaster and I want it to be big and stuff like that. I at first it was just a way for me to reach out to my friends that I did not see because of COVID. And at that time, we would talk about, like, everything that was going on, all the bullshit, what we thought was happening, with masks and lockdown, and even at that time when it was like the curfew and stuff like this. But as I watched, I looked back. Like I started to see all those conversations were done with anger, and I was having drinks because we were so angry what was going on. We didn't know what was going on, and everybody was not seeing each other. And then I kind of stopped that because I noticed I was falling into that pattern. I was like,
Mhm.
no, I don't want to do this. This is just becoming getting angry and having drinks and talking shit on camera. I stopped it completely. And when I started doing it again, I started focusing on like people who had amazing stories, people who have gone through some really tough things and have come out on the other end, or anything inspiring or anything that's helpful and useful that I believe people around could benefit, because like social media has got a lot of like it's like highlight reels to people's lives. People don't understand, everybody goes through everyday shit and it's okay. And that's normal. Like you say, normalizing. So I've had people on here who've dealt with like their kids stabbing their wives and having to wrestle them down to another client of mine who has seizures all the time. He can't leave the house. And, martial arts is a saving grace and how walking on the street was his challenge for the week. And
Yeah.
also any person that I know, who's overcome some stuff or has something positive, has a good story, I want them on here. So when I heard that you did this stuff, I was like, man, this is great information. And I'll eat whatever circle of people that I reach with my small platform. It doesn't matter. I just think that it's something worth being said, that we should say it and have it documented, right? So, like I said, it's a pleasure. I'm sure maybe we could do this again sometime. I'd like to actually have some people on here who maybe have gone through trauma and maybe have it like a three-way conversation where you can kind of not like clinically assess them, but like give them some tips and they can share their story so that they can get that out there and see what the audience feels and what they say, because I know everybody's gone through trauma. Everybody's gone through trauma at some point or another, at some degree or another. And um and I do believe a lot of us have gone through trauma during COVID and don't know the impact, the full extent of the impact. I know I'm still going through it too. Like I have
Yeah.
heavy anxiety now when I go out in public. I have
Yeah.
resentment for like there's certain stores that I went to and they like freaked out on me because I didn't want to wear a mask or because I didn't do this or that. And I literally will drive by that place and I'll have resentment towards that place because of
Yeah.
how they made me feel, and I know how they made other people feel. So like we all holding on to shit, man. I think it's just important that we get the education on how to deal with it in a positive way. In a positive way.
Yeah. 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 No, I feel like there's not enough time right now, even tonight, like to talk about all that stuff. But no, I'd be very interested in, like I said, I do a 90-minute trauma informed session. I'm trying to do one with some of the senior belts at our dojo in a couple of weeks. And I've delivered it, like I said, to law enforcement, current and retired. One of the comments that I had from one who did a lot of human trafficking investigations, specifically online, especially when the web started coming up. That person, after we were done with the session, I had extended it to a 4 hour because we were getting a lot into interviewing and stuff like that too. And the comment that they made was like, I wish I would have known this 12 years ago when I started experiencing the stress from the job after 8 years. And they said, if I would have known it 12 years ago, I probably would have kept going. I wouldn't have retired after 20. I would still be a police officer.
Yeah. What is
So
it? Explain exactly what this is. This thing that you do is for people who might be interested, and you can give them kind of an idea of where they can contact you to take part in this. But give me a quick breakdown of what this workshop or seminar is.
so we go through the stages of response. So we go through those four stages. We go through victim types, so identify people based on who they are and how they're related to the situation. Once we've identified what that situation is, and then go through the phases. So like the activation phase, like I was explaining briefly. So the activation phase, what are we going to do? The action phase. Are we going to sit here and do something about it, or are we going to leave because it's too dangerous? And then the letdown phase. So we talk about that. And then after those three modules, I go through the stress continuum. So, we've been talking a lot about trauma and all this other stuff, but again, I'm not the prophet of doom, right? There's ways to cope with it. So the fourth module is about the coping, right? It's recognizing, doing the self assessments and self awareness checks, but also recognizing some of the key reactions or behaviors with people that we're interacting with, based on what we know and what we've learned from the 3 first stages in the modules. And then I actually show the stress continuum, which is a continuum basically where it has, here I'm feeling amazing, and this is all green, and it goes from like green to sort of yellow, and then orange to red. And it has categories. Now it's not an exhaustive list of things, but it has different categories of, I'm here, this is what I should be feeling, or I can be feeling. Yeah, I'm good to go. And you start to fall into like the yellow to the orange, the red and stuff like that. And it kind of gives a list of how you could be feeling at that point if you're in the red, for example. And then you go into asking yourself some questions. Okay, where was I actually before I got here? How do I get back to the yellow first? We'll do it in small steps, right? So I don't want to be in the red right now because I recognize it's a really bad place to be. I want to get back a notch. So where do I need to go? Where was I before I got here? How did I get back to orange? Let's get back there first. Take a small step back. And then ask more questions. Take a small step back to the yellow. Ask some more questions. Take a small step back to the green. But sometimes we go so far, it has this little, Venn diagram at the bottom. It says, if you're too far gone on the red, then you need to seek help right away. Right? So we go through all of that. I go through the first stages of response, the victim types, the phases, the types of trauma, and then the stress continuum based on what we learned and how to navigate that whole thing. Because we're going to walk into stuff, we're going to see stuff our entire lives, right? Today, just because, let's say, for example, I had a good session with a therapist. Awesome, I feel amazing. It doesn't mean I'm not going to experience something traumatic tomorrow. Right? It's life. We're going to deal with hard stuff. So having that stress continuum, knowing how to have that self-awareness, recognize, hey, where was I when I was feeling great? How do I get back to that? Maybe I don't have that option anymore, but how can I still get back to that? Looking at all the positive avenues to go back to being in the good spot, right? And that becomes a frame of mind. That becomes a mindset eventually, right? I know I'm going to get my butt kicked when I show up for sparring when you start to go heavy with me, right? I know it, but I still show up. Why? Because I want to learn, right? Does it suck that I lose? Sure, 100%. But it's part of it's part of it's part of the journey.
As we're discussing this, I'm having some ideas. I think we'll talk off camera later, but
yeah.
A lot of people teach self-defense and stuff like that and the mindset in order to defend themselves, but nobody speaks about what the repercussions are after being in an altercation and how to cope with that after. So that could be like a missing piece to a completer picture of what self-defense or physical altercations look like. And I'd love to have you back on here. I feel like we've been talking for like an hour and a half, but I feel like we've been only scratching the surface. And I like to take more time to promote this more so that when we do it again, we get more people watching, even though I think once people watch this, they'll appreciate it. But once again, I just want to say thanks a lot. I look forward to working with you. I look forward to talking off camera about some things that crossed my mind as you spoke. And I appreciate what you do, man.
Yeah, no problem. And if anybody wants to look for me on Facebook, I mean, you've got me.
Yeah. Where else can they reach you?
So on Facebook, it's just Eric Poirier. If on Instagram, it's Eric, I think it's _Poirier at Train for Trauma. And I'm on LinkedIn as well. So Eric and Poirier.
All right.
So they can go there.
Send me those in a message. So when I upload this, I can pin it to the comment section in the YouTube so people can get a hold of you and see what's going on in the future when you hold those workshops.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks again, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Okay.
Have a good night, Eric. Take care.